The morning shift at Romano's diner was supposed to be quiet. That's what they told Sarah Martinez when she took the job 3 months ago. Just coffee refills and the occasional breakfast rush. Nothing like the chaos of dinner service. But as she tied her apron strings and surveyed the empty vinyl booths bathed in fluorescent light, she had no idea this ordinary Tuesday would shatter everything she thought she knew about luck, kindness, and the invisible threads that connect strangers. Sarah wasn't supposed to be here. 6 months ago, she was finishing her nursing degree at State University, 3 weeks away from graduation. Then her father's construction accident happened. The medical bills came like an avalanche, burying her family's modest savings under an impossible mountain of debt. Her dreams of saving lives in a hospital ward evaporated overnight, replaced by the harsh reality of serving coffee to pay for her father's physical therapy. At 23, she moved through the diner with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make every moment count. Her uniform was always spotless, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion that lived permanently behind her dark eyes. The other waitresses called her the optimist, the one who actually cared about the customers instead of just counting tips. Sarah didn't see it as optimism. She saw it as survival. The bell above the entrance chimed at exactly 7:45, announcing the arrival of the morning's first customer. Sarah looked up from wiping down the counter to see a man she didn't recognize, and in a neighborhood where she knew every regular by their coffee preference, that was unusual. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that didn't belong in a place like Romano's. But what caught her attention wasn't his obvious wealth. It was the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like someone carrying an invisible weight. He chose a booth by the window, sliding onto the cracked vinyl seat with careful precision. His hands, Sarah noticed as she approached with a menu and water glass, trembled slightly as he placed them flat on the formica table, not from age or illness, but from something deeper. Something that made her trained instincts as an almost nurse kick into high gear. "Good morning," she said, setting down the water glass with a gentle clink. "Can I start you off with some coffee this morning?" Her voice carried the warmth that had made her professors at nursing school predict she'd be exceptional at patient care. The man looked up, and Sarah saw something in his pale blue eyes that made her pause. It wasn't just sadness. It was the kind of profound emptiness that comes from losing something irreplaceable. "Coffee would be fine," he said quietly. His voice was cultured, refined but hollow. "Just black coffee." Sarah nodded and moved toward the coffee station, but something made her glance back. The man was staring out the window, but his gaze seemed focused on something far beyond the busy street. His right hand had moved to his chest, fingers pressed against his shirt as if he were checking for something that should be there but wasn't. She poured the coffee with extra care, making sure it was fresh and hot. When she returned to his table, she noticed he was still touching his chest, a gesture so unconscious and repetitive it spoke of habit born from desperate hope. "Here you are, sir," she said, placing the cup before him. The man's hand dropped to the table and he managed a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you." His fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug as if seeking warmth, but Sarah could see the slight tremor hadn't stopped. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on something small and metallic that had been hidden beneath the table. The object skittered across the linoleum with a soft tinkling sound, coming to rest near the man's polished leather shoes. Sarah bent to retrieve it, her fingers closing around what felt like jewelry. When she straightened and opened her palm, her breath caught in her throat. It was a locket, clearly antique, made of rose gold that had developed the warm patina that only comes with age and constant handling. The surface was intricately engraved with delicate scrollwork surrounding a small cluster of what appeared to be genuine pearls arranged in the shape of a flower. It was the kind of piece that belonged in a museum or a family vault, not on the floor of a neighborhood diner. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said softly. "I think you dropped this." The man looked down at the locket in her outstretched palm, and the transformation that came over his face was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and something approaching terror, and his entire body went rigid as if he'd been struck by lightning. That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His hands began to shake violently, not just the slight tremor from before, but a full-body trembling that made the coffee cup rattle against the saucer. "Where did you find that?" Sarah's nursing instincts kicked into overdrive. The man was showing signs of shock. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that screamed medical emergency. She quickly slid into the booth across from him, placing the locket gently on the table between them. "Sir, I need you to try to slow your breathing," she said, her voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone she'd learned in clinical rotations. "In through your nose. Hold it for 3 seconds, then out through your mouth. Can you do that for me?" The man's eyes were fixed on the locket as if it were a ghost materialized at their table. His breathing remained erratic, and Sarah could see tears beginning to form. "I lost this," he said, his voice breaking. "I lost this 53 years ago. I've spent 53 years looking for it. I've hired private investigators, I've offered rewards, I've never stopped looking." His hand reached toward the locket but stopped inches away, as if he were afraid it might disappear if he touched it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. 53 years. The locket looked old, certainly, but not ancient. Someone had clearly treasured it, had worn it regularly, judging by the smooth patina on the gold. But if this man had lost it over 5 decades ago, how had it ended up under a table in Romano's diner? "Can you tell me about it?" she asked gently, keeping her voice soft and encouraging. Sometimes talking about traumatic memories could help stabilize someone in shock, and she could see this man was balancing on the edge of a complete breakdown. The man's hand finally made contact with the locket, his fingers tracing the engraved surface with a reverence that spoke of profound love and loss. "It was my wife's," he said, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "Eleanor. She wore it every day from our wedding day until the accident. She was wearing it when they told me she didn't survive." Sarah felt her own eyes begin to sting. The grief in this man's voice was raw and immediate, as if the loss had happened yesterday instead of decades ago. But there was something else in his expression now, something beyond just the pain of remembered loss. There was hope, fragile and terrifying, but unmistakably present. The locket had been buried with her, he continued, his voice growing stronger even as the tears continued. I thought it was gone forever. But 2 weeks after the funeral, when I went to visit her grave, the groundskeeper told me there had been a break-in. Grave robbers. They'd disturbed several plots, including Eleanor's. The locket was gone, along with her wedding ring and a few other pieces. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward the man's across the table, a gesture of comfort she'd made countless times during her clinical training. The story was heartbreaking, but it didn't explain how a piece of stolen jewelry from a 53-year-old grave robbery had ended up in a diner in the present day. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "That must have been devastating. To lose her and then to have someone steal something so precious." The man nodded, finally lifting his gaze from the locket to meet Sarah's eyes. What she saw there made her heart clench. This wasn't just grief. This was a man who had been carrying an impossible burden for over half a century. "I never remarried," he said quietly. "Never even considered it. Eleanor was my everything, and this locket, this was the last piece of her I had left. When it was stolen, I felt like I'd lost her all over again. I've spent more money than you can imagine trying to find it. I've followed false leads from coast to coast. I've bought dozens of similar lockets from antique dealers, hoping one might be hers. But I always knew I'd recognize it if I saw it again. The pearls, you see." She had them reset from her grandmother's earrings when we got engaged. They're arranged in the shape of a forget-me-not, her favorite flower. Sarah looked down at the locket, and now she could see it. What she had initially taken for a random cluster of pearls was indeed arranged in the distinctive 5-petal pattern of a forget-me-not. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master jeweler who had taken great care to honor both the original earrings and the new purpose they would serve. But the mystery remained. How had this locket, stolen from a grave in what must have been the early 1970s, found its way to this exact spot at this exact moment? Sarah was a practical person trained in science and evidence-based thinking. She didn't believe in fate or cosmic intervention. But as she sat across from this broken man whose impossible hope had just been fulfilled in the most unlikely way imaginable, she found her skepticism wavering. The man had stopped crying, but his hands continued to shake as he held the locket. He fumbled with the clasp for a moment before managing to open it. Inside, Sarah could see a tiny photograph, faded but still clear enough to make out the face of a beautiful woman with dark hair and a radiant smile. Opposite the photo was an inscription in elegant script too small for Sarah to read from across the table. "That's her," the man whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "That's my Eleanor. She was 24 when this picture was taken. We'd been married for 3 years and she'd just found out she was pregnant. We lost the baby 2 months later and she never conceived again. But she said this locket would hold all the love we couldn't give to children. All the dreams we'd share together instead." The weight of his words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Sarah found herself thinking about her own interrupted dreams, her own detoured plans. But her sacrifice felt small compared to what this man had endured, to lose a wife, a child, and then the final physical connection to both of them. To spend 53 years searching for something that represented not just love, but hope itself. "Sir," Sarah said gently, "I have to ask, what's your name?" Throughout this entire encounter, they had been strangers connected by an impossible moment. But something told her this story was far from over. The man looked up from the locket, and for the first time since she'd found it, he seemed to truly see her. His eyes took in her worn uniform, her concerned expression, the genuine care that radiated from her every gesture. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested his name might be familiar to her. "My name is William Ashford," he said quietly, "and I think I need to tell you the whole story." Sarah felt a jolt of recognition at the name, though she couldn't immediately place why it sounded familiar. William Ashford sat back in the booth, the locket still cradled in his trembling hands, and she could see him gathering himself to share something that had clearly been locked away for decades. "I should probably start from the beginning," he said, his voice steadier now, but still fragile. "Eleanor and I met in 1968. I was 26, just starting out in my father's construction business. She was working at the local library, saving money to become a teacher. We were married within 6 months, and I swear to you, every day with her felt like a gift I didn't deserve." William paused, running his thumb over the locket's surface with practiced familiarity. Sarah noticed other customers had begun filtering into the diner, but something about this moment felt sacred, untouchable by the ordinary rhythms of breakfast service. "The business grew quickly in those days," he continued. "Post-war construction boom. New developments going up everywhere. By 1970, we had contracts all over the state. Eleanor used to joke that I was building half the houses in the county, but she was the one building our home. She had this way of making everything feel warm and safe, you know. Even when we lost the baby, even when the doctors said there wouldn't be others, she never let bitterness take root." Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite the growing sounds of morning activity around them. There was something in William's voice that suggested this wasn't just a tale of lost love, but something more complex, more troubling. In 1971, everything changed. William said, his expression darkening. We got a contract for a large development on the east side of town. Luxury homes, the kind of project that could set us up for life. But there were problems from the start. The previous owner of the land, an elderly man named Joseph Romano, claimed we didn't have legal right to build there. Said his family had never agreed to sell. Sarah's blood ran cold. Romano. Like Romano's diner where they sat right now. She glanced around the familiar space with new eyes, wondering if this could possibly be connected to the same family. Romano fought us in court for months, William continued, unaware of Sarah's realization. He claimed the sale was fraudulent, that someone had forged his signature on the deed. My father, he was old school, believed in doing whatever it took to complete a job. He hired people to pressure Romano, to make him understand that fighting us was futile. I was young, ambitious, and I trusted my father's judgment completely. The coffee in William's cup had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were focused on something far beyond the diner walls, lost in memories that had clearly haunted him for decades. Romano had a daughter, Maria. She worked at the courthouse, had access to all the legal documents. My father's people approached her, offered her money to make certain papers disappear. When she refused, they got more aggressive, threatened her job, her family's reputation. I didn't know any of this was happening, Sarah. I swear to you I was focused on the construction, on building something beautiful for Eleanor and me. Sarah felt a sick certainty growing in her stomach. She'd grown up in this neighborhood, had heard stories from the older residents about families who'd been driven out by corrupt developers in the 70s. Stories that always seemed too awful to be entirely true. The pressure campaign worked, William said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria Romano was found dead in her apartment 3 days before a crucial court hearing. The official cause was ruled a heart attack, but she was only 28 years old with no history of heart problems. The case against us collapsed without her testimony, and we broke ground 2 weeks later. The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah could see William's hands shaking again, not from grief this time, but from something deeper. Guilt, shame, the weight of a secret that had been crushing him for over 50 years. I didn't learn the truth until much later, he continued. By then, the houses were built, the profits were made, and my father was dying of cancer. On his deathbed, he told me everything. How they'd threatened Maria Romano, how her death was no accident, how our entire fortune was built on intimidation and murder. Sarah's mind raced. If this was the same Romano family, then the diner they sat in might have been built on the settlement money from their daughter's death. The bitter irony of William's locket being found here, in a place connected to his family's darkest crime, felt like something beyond coincidence. I confronted Eleanor that night, William said, tears beginning to flow again. Told her everything my father had confessed. She was devastated, horrified. Said we had to make it right, had to find the Romano family and try to provide some kind of justice. We stayed up all night planning how we'd liquidate everything, how we'd turn over evidence to the police, how we'd spend the rest of our lives trying to atone for what my family had done. He closed his eyes, and Sarah could see him reliving that night. The last night his world made sense. The next morning, Eleanor was driving to the courthouse to meet with a prosecutor she'd contacted. She wanted to be the one to turn in the evidence, said it was the only way she could live with herself. The car accident happened at the intersection of 5th and Main. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her head-on. She died instantly. Sarah felt tears stinging her own eyes. The intersection of 5th and Main was less than 2 blocks from the diner. Eleanor Ashford had died trying to right a terrible wrong, and now her locket had somehow found its way back to the very neighborhood where that wrong had been committed. I fell apart after that, William admitted, lost in grief and guilt and the terrible knowledge that I was benefiting from blood money. I couldn't bring myself to follow through on Eleanor's plan. Instead, I threw myself into searching for the locket, convinced that if I could find it, I could somehow bring her back, or at least find some kind of peace. The morning rush was beginning in earnest now. Sarah could hear her manager calling for orders, could see other waitresses shooting her curious glances as she remained seated with the well-dressed man who'd been occupying a booth for nearly an hour. But she couldn't move. This story was far from over, and somehow she knew her own fate was becoming intertwined with William's in ways she couldn't yet understand. "I spent decades looking," he said. "Hired private investigators, followed up on every lead, no matter how ridiculous. I convinced myself that finding the locket would give me the strength to finally do what Eleanor wanted. To expose my family's crimes and try to make amends to the people we'd hurt." William's eyes met Sarah's across the table, and she could see a desperate hope building there. "But I never could find it. Years turned into decades, and I grew older and weaker and more convinced that I was being punished for my cowardice. That Eleanor's locket would remain lost forever because I didn't deserve to have it back." He lifted the locket from the table, holding it up to catch the morning light streaming through the diner window. "Until now. Until you, Sarah. You found it exactly where it needed to be found, at exactly the moment when I was ready to give up forever. Don't you see, this isn't coincidence. This is Eleanor giving me one last chance to do what's right." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in William's voice, a certainty and determination that hadn't been there before. He was looking at her not just as the waitress who'd found his wife's locket, but as something else entirely. A sign, perhaps, or an instrument of fate. "Sarah," he said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What's your last name?" The question caught her off guard. Of all the things she'd expected him to ask, that wasn't one of them. But something in his expression told her this wasn't casual curiosity. This was important in ways she couldn't yet grasp. "Martinez," she said slowly. "Sarah Martinez. Why do you ask?" William's face went pale again, but this time it wasn't from shock or grief. This was something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion he'd been harboring. "Your mother's maiden name," he pressed. "Do you know what it was?" Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. This conversation had taken a turn she didn't understand, but every instinct told her to be careful with her answer. "Romano," she said quietly. "My mother's maiden name was Romano." The locket slipped from William's fingers and clattered onto the formica table. His eyes widened with a mixture of horror and wonder, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Maria Romano was your grandmother." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt the breath leave her lungs as the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. Maria Romano, her grandmother. The woman she'd heard whispered about in family conversations that always stopped when children entered the room. The woman whose photograph sat on her mother's dresser but whose story was never fully told. William was staring at her with an expression of profound shock mixed with something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who had finally found the missing piece of a story that had been haunting him for over half a century. "Your grandmother," William said, his voice shaking. "Maria Romano. She was 28 years old when she died. She worked at the courthouse. She had dark hair and the most determined eyes I'd ever seen. I only met her once briefly during one of the court proceedings. She looked at me with such contempt, such righteous anger. She knew what my family was doing and she refused to be part of it." Sarah's mind was reeling. Her grandmother had died when Sarah's mother was just a baby. The family had always said it was sudden, unexpected. A heart attack, they claimed, though Sarah's mother had always seemed uncomfortable discussing the details. Now she understood why. The diner around them had faded into background noise. Sarah was dimly aware of other customers, of the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine, but it all felt distant and unreal. The only thing that mattered was this moment, this impossible convergence of past and present that felt orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding. "My mother never knew," Sarah whispered. "She was just a baby when it happened. My grandfather, Maria's husband, he raised her alone. He never talked about what really happened. Just said that Maria died young and that some secrets were too painful to share." William nodded slowly, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. He probably knew more than he ever said. The Romano family knew they were being targeted. They knew the danger. But Maria, she was brave in a way that most people never have to be. She chose to fight for what was right, even when it cost her everything. Sarah felt a strange sensation building in her chest. Pride mixed with grief for a woman she'd never known but whose blood ran through her veins. Her grandmother had been a hero, someone who'd stood up to powerful men who thought they could buy or intimidate their way to whatever they wanted. After the accident, William continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "After Eleanor died, I tried to find your family. I wanted to confess everything, to try to make some kind of amends. But your grandfather had moved away, changed his name. He'd taken your mother and disappeared completely. I hired investigators, spent thousands of dollars, but it was like you'd all vanished into thin air." Joseph Romano had been smarter than William's family had given him credit for. He'd seen what happened to his daughter, had understood that staying in the area would only put his remaining family at risk. So he'd taken his infant granddaughter and started over somewhere else, building a new life on the ashes of the old one. The locket sat between them on the table, no longer just a piece of lost jewelry, but a bridge connecting two families whose fates had been intertwined by tragedy and guilt for over 50 years. Sarah stared at it, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. "This can't be coincidence," she said finally. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. "The locket showing up here now, with me finding it. My working in a diner that might have been built with settlement money from my own grandmother's death. It's too much. It's impossible." William reached across the table and gently took her hand. His skin was papery and cold, but his grip was firm. "Not impossible, Sarah. Necessary. Eleanor always believed that the universe has a way of correcting itself, of bringing truth to light when the time is right. I think she's been waiting 53 years for this moment. For me to finally meet someone from the Romano family. For me to finally have the courage to do what's right." Sarah looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift inside her. All her life she'd wondered about her family's history, about the gaps in their story that no one would explain. She'd grown up feeling like there were shadows in her past, secrets that shaped her family in ways she couldn't understand. Now those shadows were stepping into the light, and the truth was more complex and heartbreaking than she could have imagined. "William," she said slowly, "what exactly are you asking of me?" He released her hand and picked up the locket again, holding it with the same reverence she'd seen since the moment she'd placed it in his palm. "I'm asking you to help me finish what Eleanor started. I'm asking you to help me finally tell the truth about what my family did to yours." The weight of his request settled over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about returning lost property or providing comfort to a grieving widower. This was about justice delayed for more than half a century. This was about bringing to light crimes that had been buried under decades of silence and shame. "I have evidence," William continued, his voice gaining strength and purpose. "Documents my father kept, correspondence with the men he hired, records of payments made to silence witnesses. I've kept it all these years, too cowardice to act on it, but too guilty to destroy it. With your help, with your family's permission, we could finally expose what really happened to Maria Romano." Sarah thought about her father lying in a hospital bed struggling with his recovery. She thought about the medical bills that had forced her to abandon her dreams of becoming a nurse. She thought about her mother working double shifts at the factory to help make ends meet. The Ashford family's crimes had set in motion a chain of events that had shaped her entire life, had kept her family struggling and scraping by while the perpetrators lived in comfort built on blood money. But she also thought about William himself, this broken man who had spent over 5 decades carrying the weight of his family's sins. He could have easily hidden the truth forever, could have taken his secrets to the grave and left the Romano family none the wiser. Instead, he was asking her to help him destroy his own family's reputation and legacy. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate scheme?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. The grief in William's eyes was too real, too raw. The way he held Eleanor's locket spoke of a love and loss that couldn't be fabricated. William nodded as if he'd expected the question. "Because I'm prepared to give you everything," he said simply. "Every penny of the fortune my family built on your grandmother's grave. Every property, every investment, every asset. I want to establish a foundation in Maria Romano's name, dedicated to fighting corruption and protecting whistleblowers. And I want your family to oversee it." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as the magnitude of his offer sank in. He wasn't just talking about an apology or even a settlement. He was talking about transferring an entire fortune built over decades to the family his crimes had destroyed. "I don't want your money," she said instinctively. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but the thought of profiting from her grandmother's death felt wrong. Tainted. William smiled for the first time since she'd found the locket. A sad but genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Eleanor said you'd say that," he said softly. "She always believed that the Romano family would be different from us, that they'd understand the difference between justice and revenge." Sarah stared at him, confused. "Eleanor said I'd say that? But she died 50 years ago. She never met me." William's smile grew slightly wider, and for the first time Sarah could see hints of the younger man he'd once been. "After she died, I used to talk to her. Out loud, I mean. I'd sit by her grave and tell her about my day, about the investigation I was funding to find the locket, about my plans to someday make things right with your family. It probably sounds crazy, but I swear I could feel her responding sometimes. Guiding me." He paused, his fingers tracing the locket's engraved surface with practiced familiarity. "Last night, after I'd decided to give up the search forever, I had the most vivid dream about her. She was standing in a place I didn't recognize, somewhere bright and warm. She told me that tomorrow would be the day, that I'd find what I was looking for, but more importantly, I'd find who I was looking for. She said the Romano family would help me finish what we'd started together." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She'd never been particularly spiritual, had always been more inclined toward scientific explanations for unusual events. But there was something about this entire morning that felt touched by forces beyond normal understanding. The bell above the diner entrance chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see her manager approaching their table with an expression of barely controlled irritation. Sarah had been sitting with one customer for over an hour, while the morning rush built around them. "Sarah, I need you back on the floor," her manager said curtly. "This is a diner, not a counseling center." Sarah looked from her manager to William, torn between her professional obligations and the feeling that this conversation was far from over. William seemed to understand her dilemma. "Of course," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an elegant leather wallet. "Please allow me to compensate the establishment for monopolizing Sarah's time." He placed several $100 bills on the table, far more than any reasonable tip or compensation would require. Sarah's manager's expression shifted from irritation to surprise, to something approaching obsequiousness. The sight of that much cash had a transformative effect on his attitude. "Take all the time you need," he said to Sarah, suddenly all smiles and accommodation. "Mr. Ashford," William supplied. "William Ashford." Sarah saw her manager's eyes widen slightly with recognition. The Ashford name clearly meant something to him, probably connected to the construction company that had built half the developments in the area over the past several decades. "Mr. Ashford, of course," her manager said with newfound respect. "Please, stay as long as you'd like. Sarah, you just take care of Mr. Ashford's needs." As her manager retreated, clearly pleased with himself for handling the situation so diplomatically, Sarah felt a familiar twist of disgust. Money talked, just as it always had. Just as it had when William's family had used their wealth and influence to silence her grandmother 53 years ago. William seemed to read her thoughts. "I know how it looks," he said quietly. "Using money to get what I want. It's been the Ashford way for generations. But I swear to you, Sarah, this time it's different. This time I'm trying to use it to right a wrong instead of perpetuating one." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or manipulation. All she saw was a man who had been carrying an impossible burden for most of his adult life. A man who had finally been given a chance to set down that burden and walk free. "What would happen to you," she asked, "if we did what you're suggesting? If we exposed everything your family did?" William was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Legally, probably nothing," he said finally. "The statute of limitations ran out decades ago. Most of the people directly involved are dead, but socially, financially, personally, it would destroy everything the Ashford name represents in this community. Our reputation, our business relationships, our standing in society. Everything my family built would crumble, and you're prepared for that?" He picked up the locket one more time, opening it to reveal Eleanor's photograph. The young woman in the picture smiled back at them, frozen forever in a moment of happiness and hope. "I've been dead inside for 53 years, he said softly. "If exposing the truth means I can finally start living again, then yes. I'm more than prepared. I'm eager." Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the future, about the kind of world she wanted to help create. A world where truth mattered more than comfort, where justice delayed wasn't justice denied forever. "I'll need to talk to my family," she said finally. "This affects all of us. My mother deserves to know what really happened to her mother. My father, despite everything he's going through, he'll want to be part of this decision." William nodded eagerly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Sarah, there's something else. Something I haven't told you yet." She looked at him expectantly, wondering what other revelations this impossible morning might hold. "The development that was built on your family's land, the one that cost Maria her life, it's still there. Luxury homes just as we planned, but the profits from that development, they've been sitting in a special account for 53 years. Growing, accumulating interest, waiting for the day when I'd find the courage to return them to their rightful owners." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that the blood money from your grandmother's death has grown into nearly $12 million. And every penny of it belongs to the Romano family." The number hit her like a physical blow. $12 million, enough to pay for her father's medical bills 100 times over. Enough to complete her nursing degree and put her through medical school if she wanted. Enough to lift her entire family out of the cycle of struggle that had defined their lives for generations. But it was also the price of her grandmother's life, the profit from a crime that had never been punished. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. William seemed to understand her internal struggle. Eleanor always said that money earned through suffering could only find peace when it was used to prevent more suffering. Maybe that's why the locket found its way back to us now. Maybe it's time to transform something evil into something good. Sarah looked around the diner, at the familiar worn booths and cracked vinyl, at the other waitresses rushing to serve their customers, at the ordinary world that had suddenly become the stage for an extraordinary reckoning. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her place in the world had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single morning. The locket sat between them on the table, Eleanor's final gift to a husband she'd loved and lost, and now to a granddaughter she'd never met of a woman whose death she'd died trying to avenge. It was more than jewelry now. It was a promise, a responsibility, a call to action that couldn't be ignored. "William," Sarah said, her voice stronger and more certain than it had been all morning, "I think it's time we finished what Eleanor and my grandmother started." William's face transformed at her words, years of guilt and grief seeming to lift from his shoulders like morning fog dissipating in sunlight. He reached across the table and clasped both of her hands in his grip firm despite the trembling that hadn't entirely subsided. 2 hours later, they were sitting in William's car outside Sarah's modest apartment building. The ride had been mostly silent, both of them processing the magnitude of what they were about to set in motion. William had insisted on driving her home so she could speak with her family immediately, understanding that every moment of delay would only make the revelation more difficult. "Sarah," he said as she reached for the door handle, "before you go up there, I need you to understand something. Once we start this process, there's no going back. The truth has a way of taking on a life of its own. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for that?" She looked at him. This man who had spent more than half a century living with the consequences of his family's sins. The weight of that burden was visible in every line of his face, every silver hair, every moment of trembling uncertainty. But there was something else there now, too. Hope, real tangible hope for the first time in decades. "I've been running from my family's history my whole life without even knowing it," she said quietly. "Living in the shadow of something I couldn't understand. At least now I can step into the light, even if it burns a little." William smiled, and Sarah could see glimpses of the young man he'd been when Eleanor was alive, before guilt and grief had carved deep channels into his soul. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. "She always said that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." Sarah nodded and stepped out of the car. As she walked toward her building, she could feel the weight of the locket in her pocket. William had insisted she keep it, at least temporarily. A symbol of trust, he'd called it. A promise that they were in this together. This story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can unlock the biggest truths. Sarah Martinez could have simply returned the locket and gone back to her tables. William Ashford could have taken his secrets to the grave. But they both chose courage over comfort, justice over silence. Their meeting wasn't just coincidence. It was the universe finally balancing the scales, proving that love and truth are more powerful than money and time. Sometimes what we think we've lost forever is just waiting for the right moment to come home.